I always assumed grief would be the hardest part, not betrayal, not paperwork, not the gnawing silence between people who once called each other family, but the grief, raw and unpredictable. Turns out grief was easy. It was familiar. What I didn't expect was the slap that came wrapped in mahogany leather and legalese. We were gathered in the law office of Hollister and Barr, seated in a tight, windowless conference room that smelled like old dust and new tension. The chairs were too stiff, the coffee too bitter, and the temperature too cold for a day in June. I sat at the end of the long table, alone. My brother, Caleb, and his wife, Monica, took the opposite side by side, as always. Symmetrical, smug, and polished. Monica wore pearls. Who wears pearls to a will reading? They didn't look at me. They hadn't since the funeral. My father, Elliot Morgan, died 2 weeks earlier. Heart failure, the doctor said. Peaceful. Unexpected. He was 67. A man who built his fortune on real estate and self-discipline, who rarely raised his voice but never needed to. His silence did all the punishing. He loved rules and routine and appearances, and I didn't. I was the youngest, the only daughter, the disappointment. I studied art instead of finance, wrote essays instead of emails, worked for nonprofits, taught community classes, never married. Caleb, on the other hand, was perfect. Business school, a family, a house in the suburbs. He could speak in quarterly earnings and play golf without irony. Dad called him steady. He called me spirited, which, in his language, meant reckless. Still, I visited every Sunday, even when no one else did, even when my calls went unanswered for weeks. I brought him books, talked to him about politics, held his hand at the hospital. So when the lawyer opened the will and began reading, I leaned forward and I listened. To my son, Caleb Morgan, I leave the Morgan estate property in full and all remaining family holdings, accounts, and trusts. I trust he will preserve the family name and legacy. Monica's hand found Caleb's knee. He didn't smile, but his eyes glittered. Calculated humility. To my daughter, Elise Morgan, the lawyer continued, I leave my journals located in the lockbox beneath my study desk. She always saw things I missed. Perhaps now she'll understand why. That was it. No house. No share. Not even the trust fund I knew existed. Just journals. There was a pause, not legal but emotional. Everyone looked at me, except my brother. He looked down, like he couldn't bear it, like he knew. I stood up slowly. No words. Not because I didn't have them, but because I didn't trust myself not to scream. The lawyer handed me a key, silver and worn, the kind of thing that might unlock nothing, or everything. I walked out without looking back. Not even when Monica muttered, maybe now she'll finally grow up. It wasn't about the money. It was about what the money represented. Trust, worth, belonging. And once again, I had been weighed, measured, and left behind. That night, I sat on my apartment floor and stared at the key. I hadn't cried yet. Still hadn't. I told myself it was because I was strong. But really, I just hadn't found the right moment. Around midnight, I drove to the house. The Morgan estate, colonial, white-bricked, surrounded by sycamore trees and gilt. Caleb had already started moving in, but the study was untouched. I still had the alarm code. The lockbox was exactly where the will said it would be, under the desk behind a false panel. The key clicked easily. Inside, 3 leather-bound journals. No title, no dates, just my father's neat, meticulous handwriting. I took them home, read the first page, and felt my throat tighten, not because of grief, but because of truth. If you're reading this, Elise, then I'm gone. And that means you've been cut out by my own hand. I need you to understand, I didn't do it out of spite. I did it to protect you from what I couldn't protect myself from. I turned the page, then another, and another. Each one was more revealing than the last. Affairs, shell companies, manipulated trusts, deals made under false names. And at the center of it all, Caleb, the golden son, the loyal heir, the one Dad had spent years covering for, cleaning up messes, bailing out bankruptcies, buying silence. I sat there until the sun rose, eyes burning, hands trembling, mouth dry. My father didn't leave me money. He left me a confession, and maybe a weapon. I closed the journal slowly and whispered to the empty room. You thought you erased me, but you gave me everything I need. When I was a child, I believed my father could fix anything. A jammed door, a broken wristwatch, a bad grade on a math test. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His silence alone could curdle milk. But when something mattered, when I was really hurting, he had a way of making the world feel still, steady, unshakable. I clung to that illusion for years, even after it stopped being true. Now, I was staring down the unraveling of that very man, one journal entry at a time. There were 3 journals in total, each more intimate than the last. Not business ledgers or financial logs, but confessions. Painful, precise, purposefully written. It felt less like reading a diary and more like listening to a man unravel in slow motion. The second journal is where the truth began to sharpen, not in accusations, but in self-awareness. Caleb started drinking in college. He wrote, nothing dangerous at first, but he didn't know how to handle disappointment or shame. I suppose I taught him that to bury those things instead of facing them. The first time I paid off his debt, I told myself it was love. By the 3rd time, I told myself it was obligation. But by the 5th, I knew what it really was, cowardice. I stared at that word, cowardice. My father, the man who commanded boardrooms and carved fortunes out of downtown Atlanta, called himself a coward. Not once, several times. He listed the bailouts, credit card fraud, masked as startup capital, a lawsuit from a fired employee that never made the papers, 2 offshore accounts moved under Elliot's name when Caleb's personal account was frozen. It was all strategic, clean, buried in shell companies and whispers. I thought I could keep him afloat until he grew into himself. One entry read, but the truth is, I was scared of what would surface if I let him sink. It made me sick. And worse, it made sense. The strained dinners, the closed-door conversations, the way Dad never praised me for things that mattered, but always praised Caleb for the bare minimum. He wasn't just blind. He was protecting him. And what did I get? Elise was always the mirror I didn't want to look into. He wrote, where Caleb avoided pain, she named it. Where he deflected blame, she held it up to the light. She made me feel small, but not because she wanted to, because she saw me clearly. That's why I couldn't give her anything. I didn't want to owe her, too. I had to put the journal down. My hands were shaking. Later that morning, I called a name I hadn't said aloud in 5 years, Martin Kessler, my father's old attorney and financial advisor. A man with ethics so gray they were practically smoke. He answered on the second ring. Miss Morgan, I'm surprised to hear from you. We need to meet. Privately. There was a pause. Then, downtown. For PM, don't be late. Martin's office was far less sterile than Hollister and bar. Heavy curtains, dusty books, whiskey on the table at all hours. He looked exactly the same, bald, stern, and dressed like a man who knew how to hide millions legally. I assume this is about the estate, he said, folding his hands. It's about the parts you didn't report. That made him pause. I slid the first journal across the desk. He read the first page, and for the first time in my life, I saw Martin Kessler flinch. These are personal writings, not admissible. They're also specific. Transactions, wire routes, shell names. He closed the journal. If you're thinking about contesting the will, I'm not. His eyebrows lifted. Then what do you want? I leaned forward. I want to know how deep it goes. And what's still tied to my father's name. He hesitated, then sighed, like a man letting go of a secret he never wanted to keep. Over the next hour, Martin confirmed almost everything in the journals. Yes, there were accounts. Yes, your brother knew. Yes, your father funneled funds quietly to keep the family name clean. Yes, it was technically legal, but only barely. If this ever got out, he said, it would destroy Caleb's career. And your family's reputation. What reputation? I asked, not even smiling. Why not just take this to the press? He said, eyes narrow. Bury him. Blow it up. Because I don't want to be a bomb. I said, I want to be a scalpel. Later that night, I emailed Caleb. Just one line. We need to talk. You know why? He replied 5 minutes later. What do you think you're doing? Correcting a mistake. We met in a parking lot near the family home, neutral ground. Cold ground. He came alone. So did I. Caleb looked older than I remembered. Like guilt had finally started showing in his jawline. You read them, he said flatly. All three. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. You used him. He rubbed his eyes. I was drowning, Elise. He gave me a rope and wrapped it around me. That stopped him. You knew I wouldn't contest it. I said, you knew I'd walk away quietly, because that's what I always did. But this time, I'm not walking. So, what? You want the money now? I stepped closer. I want the truth, and I want you to live in it. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was anxious, but because for the first time in my life, I felt in control. When people think of revenge, they imagine chaos, a public outburst, a scandalous leak, a headline that stains someone's name forever. But that's not what I wanted. I didn't want chaos. I wanted correction, a quiet shift, a change in the wind, a balance returned to the place it had been denied. And I knew exactly where to start. Caleb's power didn't live in his bank account. It lived in relationships, his business connections, his donors, his seat on the board of 3 nonprofit foundations, each one a perfect place to launder virtue while keeping the family name polished and untouchable. He relied on image to shield his reputation. So I decided to reframe the image. I started with the cleanest option, documentation. The journals were personal, yes, but they named specific transactions. So I traced them, slowly, methodically, using public filings, IRS disclosures, and digital breadcrumbs. Caleb thought he had swept clean. He hadn't. Shell companies leave shells, and I cracked them. One entry mentioned a holding firm called Graybridge Ventures, a dead LLC based in Delaware, supposedly inactive. But I found a payment routed to it just 8 months ago. It took me 2 days to uncover the connection. Graybridge was registered under a trust. That trust was administered by an office suite shared with one of Caleb's foundations. In plain English, he was moving donor money meant for a youth outreach program into a private holding, then routing it back through consulting expenses. Clean, clever, criminal, and perfectly documented. I sent an anonymous tip to a friend at a financial ethics watchdog group. Not a full report, just a breadcrumb. Enough to raise questions. The next day, I sent another tip to the press, a whisper about misused donations and possible trust manipulation involving an unnamed board member of a prominent family. Still no names. Still no storm. Just wind. And wind moves things. Within a week, the foundation issued a press statement about internal auditing and restructuring. Caleb stepped down from the board temporarily. Donors pulled 2 major pledges. His PR team went quiet. And Monica started calling. "You've made your point," her voicemail said. "We get it. You're angry. But this doesn't help anyone." I didn't respond because it wasn't about anger. It was about balance. I still hadn't touched the inheritance, still hadn't challenged the will, because I didn't need the money. I needed them to understand that silence was no longer a currency they could spend. And then something strange happened. I started getting calls, not from Caleb, not from Monica, but from people my father used to know, quietly, respectfully. One from a professor at his alma mater, another from a woman he'd helped years ago during a real estate case. Then one more, a man named Robert Finn, who used to work in Elliott's construction division before it was absorbed. He left me something. Robert said, voice low, "A letter. Told me to contact you if anything ever went south with your brother." I met him at a diner 2 hours out of the city. Robert was older, kind-eyed, and sharp in the way working-class men often are, not from degrees, but from watching people lie for a living. He handed me an envelope. Inside, a signed letter from my father. "Robert, if this reaches you, it means I've failed to set things right in time. Elise will come looking for answers. Give her this. She's the one who sees things clearly." Attached to it, a USB drive, encrypted. I took it home and opened the files. There were audio recordings, conversations between Caleb and my father. One in particular stopped me cold. "Caleb, you're not actually going to give her part of the estate, are you?" "Elliot, she's my daughter." "Caleb, she's a liability. She doesn't know how the family works." "Elliot, that's the point. She's the only one who should inherit it." "Caleb, if you do this, I walk." "Elliot, then walk." Silence. "Caleb, you'll regret this." There it was. Proof. My father changed the will under pressure. He stripped me out of fear, not because I didn't deserve it, but because he was afraid of what Caleb might do. And he left a trail in case I ever came looking. I sat in the dark that night, the weight of truth sitting heavy in my chest. I didn't cry, didn't rage. I just felt steady, like the world had finally tilted back into place. I printed the transcript, made 3 copies, sealed them in envelopes, and sent them. One to Caleb, one to Monica, and one to the attorney who read the will aloud, stone-faced and complicit. No threats, no notes, no signature, just the truth. A week later, I received a certified letter from Monica's law firm. An offer, a private settlement, a sum more than fair, a confidentiality agreement, and a clause. If I accepted, I would forfeit any claim to challenge the estate publicly. I smiled because they finally understood. I didn't want to fight. I wanted the acknowledgement of what was taken, of what I should have been given. And now, they were giving it. I declined the settlement. Instead, I filed a motion with the court, not to claim the inheritance, but to reopen the will under suspicion of undue influence. Let the courts decide. Let the paper trail speak. Let the silence collapse under its own weight. Reopening a will isn't dramatic. It's not a courtroom gasping in slow motion. It's paperwork, procedures, time. But once filed, it becomes a signal, a legal flare fired into the sky that says, something isn't right here. And people start looking. My attorney, Miriam Greer, was precise, tactical, and merciless in her patience. Undue influence is hard to prove, she told me in our first meeting. We'll need more than journals and transcripts. We'll need corroboration, patterns, a motive. I nodded. I have all three. She raised an eyebrow, just one, then smiled, slow and dangerous. Let's begin. The news didn't break overnight. At first, it trickled. Small mentions in estate bulletins. A notice in the regional business journal about the motion. Then, a few whispers online. But whispers travel, especially when they have the Morgan name attached. It took exactly 9 days before Monica called me. I let it ring, then rang again, then texted. Monica, you've made your point. Can we speak like adults? I spoke. You didn't listen. Now, the courts will. A week later, the media got wind of it. And that's when things really started to move. Not in headlines, but in conversations. At Caleb's gym. At his kids' school. At his firm. People started asking questions he didn't have answers to. And Caleb started making mistakes. One of the foundation board members, a man named Dr. Langston, quietly reached out. He remembered me from childhood when I used to sit in the corner of board meetings coloring while my dad talked budgets. Your father once told me you were the only one who paid attention when no one thought you were listening. I said nothing. He continued. The foundation is distancing itself from Caleb. Quietly for now, but we're watching. Closely. At home, I reviewed more of the USB recordings. One caught me off guard. It was a voicemail my father had saved. From me, a message I barely remembered leaving. Hi, Dad, it's Elise. I just wanted to say thank you for the book and for listening last week. I know we don't always see things the same way, but I love you. I always have. My voice cracked on the last word. In the recording, silence followed. But the fact that he saved it, it mattered. Even in the shadow of everything else, the cowardice, the secrets, he kept that. And that meant he hadn't stopped loving me, even when he didn't protect me. In court, the fight was quiet. No slamming gavels. No family drama played out in front of strangers. Just records, statements, timelines. Monica wore gray suits and fake composure. Caleb wore the exhaustion of someone who's finally run out of tricks. The journals became evidence. So did the shell accounts. The recordings were ruled admissible under state law. Miriam was a scalpel. She sliced through their defense like tissue paper. Then came the turning point. A single witness, Karen Delaney, my father's former housekeeper of 14 years. She testified, hesitantly at first, then with conviction. I heard arguments, weeks before the will was changed. Mr. Morgan and Mr. Caleb, about money, about the estate. He said, "You're forcing my hand." I remember that phrase because it scared me. The courtroom shifted, not visibly, but legally. A month later, the judge made the ruling. Undue influence confirmed. The will would be amended. The original structure, a 3-way trust, restored. 1/3 to Caleb, 1/3 to Monica's children, 1/3 to me. Clean, equal, legal. But that wasn't the real win. The real win came 2 days later when Caleb called. Not from his usual number, from a private line. I picked up. Silence. Then, "You win." I almost laughed. There was never a game, Caleb. You just didn't think I knew how to play. He didn't reply. And that told me everything. I didn't throw a party, didn't post about it, didn't brag. Instead, I called Miriam and asked her how to establish a foundation. One that supports women navigating probate, inheritance fraud, and financial gaslighting by their own families. Quiet justice, I told her, for people like me. She nodded. Call it whatever you want. Just make it permanent. The media tried to spin the story. A strange daughter reclaims her share. Family fortune fractured by scandal. Let them write what they want. I wasn't here for their narrative. I was writing my own. A few weeks later, I returned to the Morgan house one last time. The study was empty, stripped, soulless, but the sun still came through the same window, casting light in the same shape across the same old hardwood. I sat at the desk and opened the last page of the last journal. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, but the words clear. Elise, if you've made it this far, then maybe, finally, I did something right. The first check arrived in a plain, white envelope. No ceremony, no embossed letterhead, just a statement of disbursement and a wire confirmation to my new business account. My 1/3 share, 7 figures, clean, untouchable, and surprisingly underwhelming. Because the truth was, I didn't feel rich. I felt free. And that's something Caleb would never understand. The Morgan name was still tangled in headlines and half-true whispers. But now, for once, I had control over what that name meant. To me, I didn't want to run from it. But I didn't want to drag its legacy like a rotting anchor either. So I made a choice. I kept the name, but I gave it a new definition. The Elise Morgan Foundation launched quietly without a press release. No gala, no donors, just purpose. We opened with one core program, Informed Inheritance, a free legal and financial literacy workshop for women dealing with family estate trauma. Our pilot filled up in 48 hours. The emails came fast. My brother stole my mother's pension. My father left everything to a woman we didn't even know. They told me I was overreacting. Thank you for proving I'm not. I read every message, and for the first time in my life, I realized that my pain was a map, and I wasn't the only one following it. Meanwhile, Caleb vanished from public boards. Monica scrubbed her social media. Their holiday cards stopped. Rumor was they'd moved to a smaller property out in the suburbs. I didn't care, because I wasn't watching anymore. But grief waited. It didn't rush in all at once. It seeped in around the edges. One morning, I made coffee and accidentally grabbed the mug my father gave me years ago, "Stay sharp," in block letters. I froze. The smell of black roast, the sound of the spoon in the cup. And just like that, I remembered. He wasn't just the man who failed me. He was also the man who taught me how to think critically. The man who quietly clipped newspaper articles about my community work and left them folded on the kitchen table. The man who never said, "I'm proud," but wrote me into every journal entry like a reluctant confession of love. Grief comes in contradictions, and I chose to hold them all. Later that week, I returned to the law office of Hollister and Barr. Same stiff chairs, same bitter coffee. But this time, I was there to speak, not listen. I handed the attorney a sealed envelope. "This is a codicil," I said, "to my will." He blinked. "You've drafted your estate plan already?" "I'm not waiting for permission to be clear." Inside the envelope was a simple request that if I died unexpectedly, 1/3 of my assets would go into a grant fund for women disinherited by coercion. I wasn't obsessed with legacy, but I believed in precedent, and I wanted mine to be clean. Miriam and I still met occasionally, usually over lunch. She always wore charcoal suits and carried 2 phones, one for court, one for her private clients. At one point, she leaned in. "You could have taken the money and disappeared. You could have destroyed your brother. Why didn't you?" I sipped my tea. Because I wasn't raised to be ruthless. I was raised to be responsible. She raised an eyebrow. "By the same man who tried to erase you?" "Especially by him." Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Elliot Morgan wasn't one man. He was many. He was a protector and a manipulator, a provider and a coward, a father and a figurehead. He was broken, but he was trying. And his final act, leaving me those journals, proved he knew he failed and wanted me to do better. One day, I visited the cemetery. No flowers, no fanfare, just me, the wind, and the engraved name on the stone. Elliot James Morgan. Father, builder, learner. Someone had placed a small compass beside the headstone. I sat for a while, and then I said, "You weren't brave enough to give me the truth while you lived, but you trusted I'd know what to do with it after." I did. The breeze picked up, or maybe it just felt that way. Back at home, I added the final transcript to my foundation's internal archive. I titled it, "Inheritance Isn't Just Wealth, It's Weight." Because for people like me, what we inherit isn't cash. It's complication. And the best we can do is carry it with clarity and make sure the next person doesn't have to do it alone. It started with a letter, a handwritten one postmarked from out of state, tucked in a plain white envelope with no return address. I knew the handwriting instantly. Caleb's. I stared at it for 2 days before opening it, not out of fear, but because I wanted to decide on my terms when to hear what he had to say. When I finally did, it wasn't long. "Elise, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve a response. But I want you to know I see it now. Everything you said, everything Dad didn't. I used to think strength was in winning. Now I think it's in facing what you broke. Thank you for holding the mirror. I hope you build something better than any of us ever did. Caleb." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. A crack in the armor, a hand extended across broken ground. And after everything, that was enough. I didn't write back. Some things don't need answers. Only acknowledgement. The foundation expanded quickly. 1 workshop became 3. 3 became 8. We partnered with 2 legal firms to offer free probate consultations, donated laptops to women who had their inheritances drained through manipulation, started publishing anonymous case studies, stories like mine, rewritten not as tragedy but as transformation. One of our first participants, Veronica, was a former nurse whose father had been tricked into cutting her out of his will by a stepmother half his age. She won her case, started a scholarship in his name, and donated half the back pay to the foundation. "I didn't want revenge," she said in a panel. "I wanted to feel seen." I smiled, because that's exactly what this all was. Not revenge. Redefinition. The estate finally closed a year after the motion. I was officially listed on the title deed as co-heir of the Morgan family holdings. I sold my share of the property, donated the land use tax to a conservation fund, and moved into a modest 2-story cottage across town. No drama, no media, just peace. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind you grow into. One afternoon, while sorting through the last of the journals, I found something taped to the inside back cover of the final volume. A photograph, faded, curled at the edges. Me, age 9, sitting on my father's lap in the garden behind the house. I was holding a book. He was looking down at me, not with frustration, not with distance, but with softness. I'd forgotten that look, maybe because it disappeared too soon, or maybe because I never saw it when I needed it most. I flipped it over. In his handwriting, the one I underestimated, the one who saw everything. I framed the photo, not out of sentiment, but as a marker that even broken things have truth buried inside them. And truth deserves to breathe. People still ask me what it feels like to have won, to have beaten the system, to have reclaimed what was stolen. And I always give the same answer. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like finally putting the pieces down. So I can stop holding the puzzle. I still carry my father's journals, not in my bag, but in my spine. The lessons, the regrets, the humanity wrapped in silence. I carry it so I don't forget, and so I can teach others how to leave that weight behind. One evening at a community event, a young woman approached me after a panel. She was maybe 22. Nervous hands, tired eyes. How did you know where to begin? I smiled. I didn't. I just knew I couldn't stay where I was. She nodded. I want to do what you did. I touched her shoulder. Then don't do what I did. Do it sooner. The past doesn't go away, but it stops biting when you stop feeding it. And somewhere between silence and justice, I found something better than revenge. Redemption. Not just for me, but for every person taught to stay quiet, play nice, and die invisible. So I write. I teach. I fight quietly. And I live. Fully. Honestly. And without apology. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for amazing stories. Bye for now.